Will you pray for me? Lord, may the words of my lips and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, because you are our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. There's a lot that we don't know about the story of Philemon and Paul and Onesimus. A lot we can't figure out, a lot that's lost to history, but here's what we know. Paul is in prison. We're not sure where, maybe Rome, maybe in Ephesus, for preaching the gospel, what he in the translation we read today calls the message. He's in prison, but sometime before gets put in prison, he has met Philemon, a wealthy person, wealthy enough to have a house big enough to have a church meet in the house, and Philemon is converted by Paul, or at least by Paul's followers and his message. So we know that Philemon looks up to Paul. Now, Philemon is rich enough to own a slave, Onesimus. Onesimus apparently has heard about Paul from Philemon, or maybe just runs into Paul while abroad. One way or another, they end up together. We're not sure how. Did Onesimus run away? Did Onesimus get sent on a message to Paul, or on an errand with a message to Paul? Maybe he ran away and got arrested and got put in jail with Paul. Maybe he just went to visit. There's a lot we don't know. But one way or another, Onesimus and Paul get together, and Onesimus, too, is converted. Sometimes slaves ran away in that time and place to run away from slavery, from a bad master, from a terrible life. Sometimes, at least as often though, they would go to find someone who could intercede on their behalf with their master. And if they did this, they weren't considered runaway slaves. It was not illegal to leave your home as a slave, even if your master forbade you to do so. It was not illegal to go and find someone to intercede on your behalf with your master. So it may be that that's what Onesimus was doing. One way or another, Paul decides to do just that, to intercede, and writes a letter to Philemon, puts it into Onesimus' hand, and sends it home. And this little letter, the shortest letter of Paul that we have, just 350-something words, it's so short. Debates have raged on it, have hinged on it, have spun on the tiny point that is this letter. This congregation that was founded to oppose American slavery in 1853, we would have sworn that Paul was saying slavery was a terrible thing and we should do away with it immediately. But there were just as many churches in other parts of the country that swore that Paul thought that slavery was a good thing and should not be abolished. Was Paul saying that Onesimus should be set free, or just that Philemon should treat him well? Your reading of the book says probably more about who you are than what Paul was actually saying. But it's hard to deny that it is a masterpiece of flattery and not so subtle manipulation. It's like a hammer wrapped in velvet, isn't it? You don't have to do this, but just remember that I saved your life, he says, right? I would hate to have to force you to do this, so I will hope that you'll do it out of the goodness of your heart, he says over and over. And down through the centuries, Christian interpreters have seen this tiny little book. When they weren't fighting about slavery, they were fighting about something else, and they said, I know what this is. This is a great allegory for all of Christian life. There's a master who owns everything. There's a slave who has somehow misbehaved and gotten in trouble. And there's an intercessor who's going to save the slave from the wrath of the master. I know this story, they said. It's just like us. God creates the entire world, and Adam and Eve, they sin, and original sin enters into the human bloodstream, so they say, and we're all born with it. We're all born sinners. They say we're all born deserving to die, deserving to be punished just as much as Onesimus was. But then we have an intercessor, a great high priest who goes to God on our behalf and says just what Paul says to Philemon for Onesimus: don't be so hard on him. Treat him like a brother. He deserves to be punished, but I'll take the punishment on myself. Somebody has to pay, and so I will pay, they say. And so Jesus crawls up on that cross, and there he pours out his blood and his life for everyone. This is just like that, they say. The slave could never have freed himself without Paul's help. He would have been in big trouble without Paul's help. And isn't that just like us? Somebody had to pay. Here's the thing about slavery in the Greco-Roman Empire. Unlike slavery in the American South and in some other places in the world, it was almost never permanent. Most slaves in that time and place expected to be freed, and soon the average length that a slave was held as a slave then was about 6 years. Most slaves were set free by the time they were 30. There were lots of good incentives for owners to do this, for slave owners to do this. I won't get into them here, but most slaves assumed that they would be set free. And when they were set free, they would be in a better place than their poor brothers and sisters, their day laboring brothers and sisters, their unwealthy brothers and sisters who had never been in slavery. Onesimus was going to be set free anyway. Everybody gets out sooner or later in the Roman Empire. You're a slave while you're in, and it's not good to be a slave. Don't get me wrong, I am not advocating this system, but everybody gets out. So maybe this is, in fact, an allegory for our lives. I don't think that we all inherited the sin of Adam and Eve. Let me be clear, I do not believe that, but I do believe that we are in bondage to sin. Or at least in bondage to somebody else's sin, or at least in bondage to evil that's abroad in the world. Haven't you sworn to stop doing that thing? And didn't you go ahead and do it 5 minutes later again? Or maybe you swore to stop doing that thing and you beat it. You gave it up. Cold turkey, you stopped forever. You were successful, but then didn't you start doing another thing right after? Hasn't somebody else's sin hurt you badly before? Haven't the people around you misbehaved enough that you wished you had never met them? Don't you pay taxes to a government who uses some of them to build bombs? Don't you live in a world where you have to drive to work at least sometimes? Don't you have to buy clothes from far distant lands made by God knows who once in a while? Or don't you find yourself doing it whether you have to or not? Friends, we are all in bondage to sin. I don't think we inherited it. I think we did it ourselves, and I think the people around us forced us into it, but I think we're chained by it just as surely as if it was in our blood. But here's the thing. Here's the thing about life with our God. Everybody gets out. Sooner or later, the chains get broken, and you do not need an intercessor to make it happen. You don't need Paul writing a letter on paper on your behalf. You don't need Jesus Christ writing a letter in blood and flesh on your behalf. God is going to set you free no matter what. God would do it even if what happened with Jesus hadn't happened with Jesus, and yet He is our intercessor. He does intercede on our behalf. He is our great high priest, and He's like Paul in this way. Paul writes to Philemon, and he says, this is your Christian brother. I don't know if he's free yet. I don't know when you're going to free him, how long it's going to be until you do it. Paul says, but you better start acting like he's your brother now. Whether he's free or not, treat him like a brother. And that is the exact same letter that Christ writes on His own flesh with His own blood, that Christ seals with His own resurrection. You may be in bondage to sin now, world, He says, but everybody gets out sooner or later. You will be free. You will sit next to God in heaven in glory and freedom. You will shine like the sun. I am proclaiming the release of the captives, He said. I am proclaiming the year of the Lord's favor, He says. Everybody gets out, He says. So you better start acting like it. Say amen.